Hello and welcome to In the Light, Growing Your Soul with me, Anna Isabel, and my guest today, who is Charles Stein. And he is the author of this marvelous book called The Light of Hermes Trismegistus, New Translations of 7 Essential Hermetic Texts. Welcome, Charles.
Welcome to you. Well, you come into the kitchen, so here we are.
Well, it's very nice to be in your kitchen talking about such a wonderful book. So, first of all, who is Hermes I can never say his name, Trismegistus?
He's a god figure from the Hellenistic period and the early Roman period of ancient Greece. He's basically a coming together of the Egyptian god Thoth with the Greek god Hermes in a context in which the origins of what is called Hermetic thought is occurring. He's both actually the god figure, and a human master who is the incarnation of that figure in the Greek world. He is known to us through a series of texts called the Corpus Hermeticum, meaning the body of writings of Hermes. And we have some 30 odd of those texts surviving from the ancient world. But it's known that there would have many, many, many more of them. Nobody knows really how many. In a kind of practitioner, a cult of practice involving an initiatory rites and practices of entering into the authentic, what is thought to be the authentic nature of the individual. That is coincident with the divine mind. One of the texts in my book is from that group, the Corpus Hermeticum, in which the person who is to be the incarnation, I'm calling it, of the Hermes figure, is receiving his own initiation in a kind of contemplative vision, in which that being speaks to him directly and answers his questions and initiates him into what actually is involved in transcending the world that is controlled by destiny, namely the world of astrology. That is to say, the way in which the individual soul's psychological condition is given to him by receiving energies from the astrological planets, and that the initiation is essentially a shedding of those energies to reveal a deeper level of being that is one with the deities. Okay, so that's the center of the whole story.
And there's so much in there. And I think the first thing I want to ask you about is, was it unusual for the ancient Greeks the Greeks in that period and the Romans to be thinking of a god incarnating on earth, or was this something that was particular to Hermes? So is there an incarnation of Aphrodite? Is there an incarnation of Athena? Or is this something about Hermes that made him special in that way?
Well, first of all, one has to understand that we're not talking about the classical Greek world. That is, say, the world from Homer through Plato and the thinkers that are immediately following Plato in the 5th and the 4th century. But something that is happening in many different forms in basically the Mediterranean world. So there are many different religious practices that are occurring at that time that have different aspects of this phenomena. And when I said incarnation, that was just to use a word that might make some kind of sense. It isn't actually a term in the Hermetic context. It's a Christian term. But if I mentioned Neoplatonism, that is the later thinkers following in the school founded by Plato, or the people that are called the Gnostics, or the people that are called the Stoics, or the people that are called various different other religious phenomena that are happening during that time. What they seem to have in common is the desire to overcome fatality. And fatality is understood as basically the condition of the human being as being in a body and being in the material world and being influenced by the astrological situation. So the texts that I am translating here are not, the only one that's actually about Hermes in this form of Hermes Trismegistus is the text that is called the Poimandres, which is one of the texts from the Corpus Hermeticum. But I'm interested in the way in which the figure of Hermes, which is more ancient than the Olympian gods, the 12 gods of the classical period, that he had an identity that was prior to that, and an identity in a sense that's subsequent to that. So it's not the Hermes figure that appears in Greek myths as the messenger god. That's an aspect of him. But the Hermes figure that I'm interested in is really an image of the very nature of mind.
And of course, that's very interesting because in astrology, there are many aspects of Hermes, i.e. Mercury, which are all to do with the mind, with thinking, with communication, and being the psychopomp and so on. So there's a lot of this that's there within astrological language today. Now, I'm also thinking about the link with Thoth, the ancient Egyptian god. So do we see this kind of fusion between the classical Greek and the Egyptian in Hellenistic period? Is that when we start seeing that happening, this fusion of the two?
Well, it's interesting that we're dealing with the time of sort of, I have to make this go away. Sorry. We're dealing with this period in which Hermes, in my view, is recovering something that's from an earlier period. But the Greeks themselves have a continuing fascination with Egypt. And as early as Herodotus, who is the early part of the 5th century, he identifies Hermes Mercury. It's not Mercury yet, but Hermes with the Egyptian god Thoth. And he even has remarks saying that the Greeks get their gods from the Egyptians, because the Egyptian society, the Egyptian culture is 2,500 years earlier than that 5th century classical period. So it's my text is not so much about recovering a history as a vision of the projection of the possibilities that this Hermes Trismegistus represents as having what I call a further life. That is the further life of the god, meaning what will happen in relationship to the imagination of that being on our territory and oncoming territory. So that's first important to say. I'm translating these poems. I'm using present day scholarship in my translation of them, but it's more than I'm trying to create a poetic form in contemporary English, which would be useful for the further imagination of that of that of that figure for our own condition.
I find it very interesting that you're talking about initiatory rites. Do we have any sense of what those rites would involve?
Well, actually, in the place that one would go for some of that would be a body of texts that survives from that period called the Greek magical papyri. The papyri is simply the term for ancient texts that survive on papyrus. But there's a body of those texts which are about every different aspect of magic. And they're all rituals. And some of them are not simply about, as a friend of mine used to say, stealing your neighbor's chickens. Or getting somebody into bed with you, or giving you power to become a wealthy or a powerful political figure, but are indeed have as their concern to bring you into relationship to your own divine nature.
Yeah. So
But
it's
we don't know a lot about those kinds of rituals. There's another one of them that I didn't mention is the mysteries of Mithras, which was basically a Persian deity that is imported during that period, and it's about a bull sacrifice, and we know more about that than we do about these things, particularly in relationship to Hermes. I should also say that Hermes has another life, not just our further life, but in the Renaissance, because a group of these texts were brought to Florence to the scholar Marsilio Ficino, who was the main person to be translating Greek text that only existed in Latin versions up to that time. And we're talking about the middle of the 15th century, the 1400s. And these texts are brought to him and he translates them. And they were believed to be older than Moses. This was a divine figure and a picture of a theological universe and the cosmology, the cosmological thinking that had a greater authority than the Judeo-Christian Islamic Bible. And so it was a very, very important influence on the thinking of the Renaissance. So during the Renaissance, it wasn't something that was particularly occult or hidden. It was part of the actual worldview. And then a number of things came to put an end to that, including Protestantism with the Protestants' abhorrence of magic, then the Counter-Reformation, which tried to outdo the Reformation in their abhorrence of any magic except their own, the magic of the church, and then finally the rise of science. But together with that, a scholar was able to demonstrate that the language of the Corpus Hermeticum, in fact, was the language of the Hellenistic period and not the language of something that could have been older than Moses, whatever date you would put to Moses, 1800 BC, say, something like that. No, maybe not 1800, a bit later. Abraham is 1800, but a few hundred years later. So that what happened was that the main thing that was that the Hermetic tradition represented in the Renaissance was a kind of syncretism, that is to say, a bringing together of many different disciplines. So you had alchemy, and you had magical practices, and you had contemplative practices, and you had astrology, and all of these different things were being brought into a vast syncretic system. And the history of that syncretic system goes from the Renaissance up till today. So if you think about somebody like Aleister Crowley, whose work called 777 was an attempt to do that same kind of syncretic bringing together, not only of the world from Europe, but China and the Middle East, and wherever he could find a kind of organized system of aspects of the world to bring them together under a single order.
So the picture I'm getting of this ancient world is one of pluralism, from the point of view that there seems to be a number of different practices that are happening. So that there's influences from Persia, there's influences from Egypt, there's influences from lots of different places. And it's not the cohesive belief system that people might be expecting.
Well, it's certainly not the cohesive belief system of Judaism or Christianity or later Islam. In fact, part of the very practice of some of them, but particularly the Hermetic one, was that in your initiation you come to an original picture of the entire system of being. That, in other words, the creative, what it means to say that you have your nature is a God, is that in your own being, your own authentic existence will involve your own activation of an imagination of being. So that is very much a part of the practice. I mean, the mind figure that speaks to the man who becomes Hermes Trismegistus will say, hold in your mind what you wish to learn, and I will teach you. In other words, it's very much about individual action, individual mental action, the construction of a picture of the world in which your own activity is contextualized by the depths of your own creative powers. And my sense of my own life and why I'm writing this particular book is this has been my path. And the path of the people who interested me most in these traditions are all people who actually create their own version. But it's not that they're all diverse. They have together, what they have in common is this activity of imaginative creation, of what I would call from Greek poiesis, the poetic imagination that is basically an act of making. And I can go on. You know.
I was just thinking about how really what we're saying is that this is a means by which people are doing inner work, understanding who they are in order to be able to transcend and have a personal connection with divinity.
Certainly, and not only that if whether or not one believes in the particular construction of astrology or any other sense of fate or destiny, there is what everyone experiences is what I call ontological conditioning. That is, we're conditioned by our culture, our society, what we read, what we do online, whatever it is, that creates a sense of the world in which we are in a sense ensorcelled. That we are captivated by thoughts that don't come from our own being, and that in our time we are in a kind of chaos of ontologies. A chaos of views of the world. And they all seem to be different kinds of institutions. And an ontology, in a sense, is an institution. What I mean by that is they tend to form collectives. And the greater the collective, more coercive the imposition of the view that they represent actually are. So for me, the Hermetic practice is a practice of disabusing oneself of one's own ontological conditioning and discovering the divine as a principle of being itself, which is none or every one of all of those ontologies. That from the point of view of the intuition, of the final intuition or the transcendent intuition, from that point of view, all of them are useful. Any ontology is something which, if you're not ensorcelled by it, it becomes part of your own inner armamentarium of possibilities. And so that's why in my book I give a major place to the figure of Parmenides. So maybe I should talk a little about that.
Yes, I think that would be a good thing to do.
Okay, all right. Parmenides, you know that there were before Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the main classical originators of the modern world of philosophy. There was a series of maybe 60 different people around the Mediterranean, but connected to mostly to Greece. They were in Asia Minor, they were in the coast of Italy, they were in Greece proper, that are today called pre-Socratics, the philosophers before Socrates. And a kind of cartoon picture of them would be as follows. Each one takes some aspect of what is, the elements, fire, water, air, earth, and treats them as if they were the source of an explanation of everything. There's a poetic figure called metonymy, which is the figure in which you take the part of something, but use it to talk about the whole. So you learn that, a nautical phrase, all hands on deck. Well, they don't mean that you cut off your hands and they all climb up the ladders and start marching around on deck. The hand means a person, but a person particular in the sense of somebody who's going to be doing some kind of work on the ship. So that's a metonymy, taking the part of something and using it to identify the whole of something. So each one of these elements that the pre-Socratics, you'll have one pre-Socratic who favors water, and he's thinking about the aspect of existence that is fluent. It flows. The one who picks the earth is thinking about that the real thing about the world is that it's solid, or the fire that the real is that it's volatile, that it disappears. But when you get to this man Parmenides, he doesn't make a metonymy. He says being. And when you come to being, you're no longer talking about a part. See what I'm saying? You got the whole shtick there, and he's actually naming what for me is the actual divine background, that being itself is different from the beings. You're a being, my computer is a being, the earth is a being, etc. And those beings are such that they come into appearance. You have some sense in which they appear to you. They either appear to you in sensual forms, perceptual forms, or they appear to you as a mental form, or as the form of things that's given to you by culture. All of those things are beings, but being itself is none of them. It has no appearance. It doesn't come to appear, but nonetheless, it's present essentially in everything that does appear. So my doctrine is everything that appears to be. And you can check that out, that it's not just that something is flashing in your consciousness and disappearing. It's a claim in the perception that perception represents something that is. And the actual deepest meaning of all of these practices and what binds them together, according to me, is that they always are going beyond the appearances, but not by denying them, not by saying they're not real, they're just an illusion, but showing that there's a relationship between appearance and being, which is available in anything that appears. And if you make the step in your own being, if you have the intuition to see that, you can take whatever it is that's happening. Everything that's happening in the material world is not in opposition to a spiritual world. It's the very context in which the spirit actually manifests.
This is the heart of many a spiritual development system, the idea that the divine is within everything, and that which actually then means that everything is sacred. So it's that life is sacred and everything, because everything has divinity within it.
Yes.
So
And that goes all the way down. That is to all of the things which one thinks of as being as far away as possible from a notion of spirituality as being immaterial.
yes.
And then that becomes very important in the practice of alchemy, because in alchemy you're dealing with the inner reality or the inner meaning of material substances. In other words, alchemy is not just early chemistry. In the very late years of alchemy in the 18th century, that's what it's put to use as. I mean, we know today that Isaac Newton spent a lot of time with alchemical experiments, but I don't think he was doing alchemy. I think he was looking to do for chemistry what he did for the physical world, for physics. He was just 100 years too early.
It's interesting.
But the actual alchemists, the alchemists that go back to basically, actually an important site in all of this is the city of Alexandria, which is in the delta of the Nile on the Mediterranean, which became a cosmopolitan city for the entire Mediterranean and all the empires and places around them. So it was a place where you would meet Jewish mystics and Egyptian priests, because you know that the last several hundred years of Egyptian culture, the pharaohs were Greeks and then Romans. The last Egyptian pharaoh was maybe 600 BC, something like that. Nonetheless, practices of the Egyptian temples continued. So there were in Hellenistic times people who had been trained within the traditional Egyptian system. And there was a struggle actually between to what degree they were to be adopting all these other cultures. But one of the texts is a text written by a very early Greek alchemist named Zosimos, who lived in a place called Panopolis, which is somewhat towards Upper Egypt, that is to say, south of Alexandria, but who probably practiced in Alexandria. And he was trained as an artisan in the Egyptian temple workshops. And what his job was, what would an artisan be who's making Egyptian statuary, Egyptian gods? The mystical practice was to imbue the statues with the presence of the deity. So he's an artist who's creating something which, within the context of Egypt, actually involves the presence of the god. And there's simply an extension of that into alchemy, because in alchemy you're not dealing with particularly the gods. You're dealing with the divine properties of materiality itself. So there's a step from Egyptian statuary, making statues into the presence of the god, into working with matter in such a way that matter really reveals its own inner magic.
Mm. So this is where we then get this whole movement within the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition of rejection of the notion of worshiping idols, perhaps, because
yeah, for sure, that
these are not idols as such, but that they were something that held the spirit of divinity within them through the practice of the creation of the artist.
Yes, and the rejection of that is really there's a very important Egyptologist named Jan Assmann, who is a Dutch scholar, who argues that the significance of monotheism was less that there is one God than there is one truth. And what you're seeing in the Hermetic world is that not that there is not an ultimate principle, but it's an ultimate principle that's beyond all the different truths, which must be multiple in order to do honor to the principle that is behind them.
So the
So in
picture,
other words, it's a kind of relationship to a oneness, but not to a single God, not to a single tradition, not to a single historical institution, but to, yeah. Okay, I'm sorry, I keep it.
no, that's wonderful. I was, it's just that as you're speaking, I'm also thinking, and I'm just again drawn to this picture of this time in the Middle East. So where there's this mix of ideas that is going around, and different people expressing or exploring different aspects of perhaps Hermeticism. And then you have the Romans coming in, and out of that, at some point, somewhere along the line there, we've also got Judaism, and then we have Christianity. And I'm just thinking that as much as we can see Christianity, Judaism, and Islam as a rejection of the older system, perhaps the Hermetic system, I can't help but feel that there's a good deal of Hermeticism that's also must have influenced these three big religions, because they're all from the Middle East.
Well, you see it in what we today call the esotericism, that the esoteric aspects of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are definitely coincident with what I'm calling Hermeticism. They're aspects of the Kabbalah, the Jewish mysticism, Sufism, and Islam, and aspects of the contemplative traditions within Christianity. It's only at the level of their own religious imperialism, as it were. That is to say, the creation of orthodoxies in which there can only be one truth, and it gets very extreme in Christianity, where you are in danger of your life if you dare show that you have any of these different beliefs. But it was part of Christianity in the Renaissance. It was only with Protestantism, which wants to get rid of the superstition of the Catholics, and the Catholics who want to do one better than the Protestants, and getting in really only their magic counts. That is, say, the magic of the Eucharist, which is a magical ritual, but nobody else can do it. Only God can do it, and only God as manifested by the institution of the Catholic Church. So you have those two things, plus the advent of science. And what is happening in the 16th, 17th century is you want to get rid of all the ideas that are not developed from empirical phenomena. And the notion of empirical phenomena gets narrower and narrower until it gets really very well defined as that which can be rendered by quantifiable concepts. The 17th century, the only thing that counts is what can be counted. And that's where we are today.
Exactly where we are today. Exactly what I was thinking. And just coming back again, I'm thinking about the Middle Ages now, and I'm thinking about the different Christian practices, different Christian sects, and in particular the Cathars as well. And it's making me think again about this thread that's coming down from ancient Egypt and just seems to remain through to our time, because it's still around us when we're talking about the idea that everything is sacred, as we've said, and so on. But it's also kind of, it's sticky, isn't it? You can't get rid of these Hermetic principles. And I think the reason is that there's a truth to them and a beauty to them, which is the very reason why I picked up your book.
I think that's so. It's just that the thread may go back much, much further. Like, for instance, we know that from simply linguistic evidence that the languages of India and the languages of Greek are part of the same family. So there's an aspect of Indian religion that is the Greeks in this period, in the Hellenistic Roman period, were aware of Indians. They had this term, the gymnosophists, meaning the naked wise one, but they're simply images of yogis. And Plotinus, who is probably the most important of the Platonic philosophers after Plato was actually planning to go to India in order, because he was aware from the rumors of the connections with them. And there's also, when Alexander the Great conquers India, there's all kinds of interactions between the Greek world and the Indian world, which has been documented by scholars. But if you think about that, what we think we know about the origins of language itself, I think the earliest date from which we have language that humans were speaking is about 80,000 years ago. That's the earliest. Probably it goes further, and it's very, very, but that means that people were talking, and with talking, some kind of thinking, for 80,000 years before the Indo-Europeans. And the question of people discovering transcendental states, psychedelic states, mystical states, it's unimaginable that they weren't discovered, that people were eating and trying everything to see what they did. And some of them killed them, and some of them made them to see the ultimate nature of being, and some of them did all kinds of other things. So I think it's a strand within human being that really, we come to the point today in which the competition among thinkings, among worldviews, among ontologies, has kind of run its gamut. So we are now living in a time in which the one ontology, which I call it a default ontology, because nobody is quite saying this yet, but there are people who are actually saying it, and it's the idea that only information is real. Physics, quantum theory, relativity theory are basically theories about the transference of information. All of biology since the 50s is entirely based on this idea of the manifestation of living forms have to do with the activation of a code. So everything, and you read, the more you read at any given science, the more you see that the idea of information is the actual bottom line. So we're living in a world in which there's a kind of information, and obviously, of course, the internet and everything having to do with this month's hysteria about AI. I don't know if you were following this, but it's the most accessed application on the internet is this chatbot business of. But one point is that information is the quantification of representation, and being itself is not representation. And therefore, a resistance to the current default ontology is a site of spiritual actual politics, in a sense. And to a certain extent, my one area of politics that I'm willing to actually activate is in the resistance to the information ontology.
So that brings us back to Hermes and the astrological Mercury, which is all about information and communication. And
well, okay, but you don't want to saying it's information. You need to quantify. You need to go to the scientific idea of information, not just that information is something that you know.
That's right.
It's the technical information theoretical of bits and bytes. Everything is reducible to bits and bytes.
And so that brings me back then to remind everyone that the book that we have been discussing is called The Light of Hermes Trismegistus. And here it is, and a fascinating a fascinating area of study. So I thank you today, Charles, for your time and for discussing your wonderful field of study with us today.
Thank you for having me.
I'll be putting a link to your book in the description box. And if people want to learn more about your work, is there a website that they can visit?
Yeah, there's actually, I have maybe 16 or 17 different books. You can find them on Amazon, and I have several other of these podcasts that I've done that's on YouTube under my name, and various other things that I do. My own website is www.charlessteinpoet.com, and there's all kinds of stuff in there.
And I'll be putting a link to your website in the description box so that people can find all the other things that you are doing. Thank you so much again, Charles.
Okay.
And thank you all for watching. Next time, we're going to be looking at, well, more herbs and gut health. Until then, have a great week. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.